beaten into obedience, starved in the dark, chained so cruelly that a father could hear his child crying right beside him and still be unable to reach out and hold them. And in some cases, enslaved people were even thrown into the sea as bait for sharks, simply because slave traders saw them as cargo, no longer worth selling. American history has too often softened that truth behind clean textbook pages, making people believe the horror of slavery began on the plantations. But for many Africans forced across the Atlantic, the torment started long before that, below deck, inside the suffocating darkness of floating prisons. Today we're going below deck to expose the most brutal punishments American history tried to make sound less cruel. This is Hidden Black Chronicles, and together we bring buried stories back into the light. Number 1. Public whipping. According to estimates from slave voyages, more than 1.8 million people died during the Middle Passage, the ocean route that carried millions of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic like living cargo. That horrifying number opens one of the darkest chapters in American history. Before many enslaved people ever set foot on a plantation, they had already passed through a floating zone of death. From a distance, the deck of a slave ship might seem like the only place where the captured could rise up and breathe. But the painful truth is that even there, on that ship, they were still beaten, starved, shackled, and forced to live through each day at sea as a long punishment before slavery on land had even begun. A sailor did not need to explain an order in every captive's language. The whip did that work for him. Public whipping on deck was not only aimed at one body, it was displayed before everyone as a cold warning sent all the way down into the hold. Anyone who refused to obey could be turned into a lesson for the rest. A young man with iron still locked around his wrists understood that one command was all it took for him to be next. A mother pulled her child close, trying to hide the sight from their eyes. But she could not hide the sound cutting across the wooden deck. Hidden violence wounded the body, but public violence reached the spirit of everyone forced to witness it. In the writings of Alexander Falconbridge, the whip appears as a tool used to force captives into obedience on the deck of slave ships. But the deeper horror is this: the punishment was not only meant to hurt one person, it was meant to teach everyone watching that resistance would be paid for in front of them. And these were not just scattered scenes of violence on a few isolated ships. Historical statistics on the Middle Passage often show that more than 1 in 10 people forced aboard did not survive to the other side. Yet in many history books, this part of the story is left like a shadow. The Middle Passage is described with clean phrases like the voyage across the Atlantic or harsh conditions, making it sound as if the suffering came from the ocean, the weather, or disease alone. But below deck, that harshness was created by brutal whippings. Only when we look directly into that space can we see how much of this dark history has been hidden, softened, or covered over by language. The case of Captain John Kimber makes the silence of history even harder to accept. In 1792, Kimber was put on trial in London over accusations involving the whipping of a young African girl aboard the slave ship Recovery. According to the accusations at the time, the girl was punished simply because she was believed to have disobeyed an order on deck, even though her body had already been weakened by days of confinement, hunger, thirst, and fear. And more than 2 centuries later, we still know his name. We know which ship he commanded. We know he once stood inside a London courtroom. But the young African girl at the center of those accusations has almost disappeared from historical memory. That raises a painful question. Do the history lessons taught in school truly show what happened inside the ships that crossed the Atlantic? Or do they preserve the names of sailors and captains while forgetting the enslaved people crowded below deck, suffering under the whip in silence? Yet even inside those ships drifting across the ocean, enslaved people did not exist, only as victims beaten down by cruelty. They were still mothers, trying to protect their children from the blows of evil men. They were still fathers, swallowing their pain, because they wanted to survive long enough to find their families again. The brutality of the whip shows us what power tried to do to them. But the way they held on to one another, the way they survived, and the way memory carried forward through generations, shows us what that power could never fully take. So public whipping on the deck of a slave ship was the mark of a system that used one enslaved person's pain to control the fear of everyone else. Yet that brutal torture is often written too cleanly in history books, buried inside lessons that speak only of harsh conditions without naming the pain behind those words. This history deserves to be called by its true name. Leave a comment if you believe those enslaved people should not be silenced by history one more time.
Number 2. Tight-packed holds. By the late 18th century, British abolitionists placed one image of the slave trade before the public: the slave ship Brooks. The diagram showed 454 enslaved Africans arranged inside the vessel. Yet records tied to that same ship show it had carried more than 600 people on earlier voyages, more than 600 human beings forced down into low, dark holds, where heat, stench, hunger, and scarce water turned every passing hour into a quiet struggle for space to move, air to breathe, and one last piece of dignity to hold on to. Below deck, that truth was even more brutal and heartbreaking. Black people were forced into a space so tight that the hold itself became a harsh punishment. The space was low, dark, airless, and crowded to the point where many had to lie pressed against one another in the same position for long stretches of time. Shoulder to shoulder, legs drawn in, backs against damp wooden planks, one person's breath mixing with another's. When one person coughed, that whole darkness had to breathe the sickness with them. When one body burned with fever, the people lying beside them had no room to move away. Sweat, vomit, waste, seawater, damp wood, and fear were locked into the same compartment, rocked back and forth by the waves. Down there, pain did not need a whip. It began in knees that could not stretch, in necks that could not turn, in chests fighting for every breath in air already used by too many people. The hold did not simply imprison them. It forced them to live inside one another's exhaustion. That was the cruelty hidden behind the word capacity. In the eyes of slave traders, more captives meant more possible sales on the other side of the Atlantic. So the space a human body needed to turn, stretch, breathe, and rest was treated like wasted room. That is why tight packing and loose packing were discussed like calculations of profit and loss, cold enough that men could argue over how many more lives could be packed inside and still call it business. Below deck, that calculation was not on paper. It was in the dry throat of a child who could not understand why the sea felt so dark and airless. It was on the body of a woman pressed against strange men, with no space to turn away from shame, pain, or sickness. It was in the shoulders of a man trapped between wooden planks, heat, and other bodies, until his whole world had been reduced to a few inches of air that someone else was also trying to claim, just to stay alive. And maybe that is why the clean diagrams in textbooks can never fully show the hidden truths behind those voyages. They show where enslaved people were placed, but not what a night felt like when a captive's body could not turn over. They show the structure of the ship, but not a mother trying to stay calm in the dark because, if she panicked, the child beside her would panic too. Lines on paper can never fully tell this one thing. Below deck, human beings were forced to live inside a space designed to make their dignity smaller. For many black families today, that pain did not end when the ship reached land. Somewhere inside those packed holds, names were separated from bodies, and families were written into records as cargo. There are descendants today who want to know where they came from, who want to find a name, a homeland, a bloodline. But history gives them back only empty spaces. Not because their ancestors had no names, but because a system decided those names mattered less than the number carried, the value sold, and the profit recorded. Number 3. Iron shackling. At first glance, an iron shackle can look far too small to hold the horror of an entire slave ship. A ring of metal, a locking hinge, a short chain linking one wrist to another. But in the darkness of the hold, that small piece of iron could decide whether an enslaved person survived one more night, or became so exhausted they were left to die and thrown into the sea. In accounts of the Middle Passage, chains appear again and again as part of the system of control aboard slave ships. Olaudah Equiano, who survived the Atlantic crossing and published his memoir in 1789, remembered the terror of being forced onto a ship, surrounded by cries, confusion, and people chained together. His account helps us understand that iron shackles were never on the edge of the story. They were there from the very beginning, before many captives even understood where the ship was taking them. Men were often shackled more tightly because they were seen as a greater risk of resistance. And that reveals a cold truth. Even after being stolen from home, trapped in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by sailors and weapons, the men controlling the ship still feared their hands and feet if they were left free. The iron locked around wrists and ankles, linking one person to another, forcing the body to submit before the spirit had even been broken. The fear of the slave traders lived inside those shackles. They knew the captives still had a will to live, still carried memories of freedom, and still had the power to resist if even one link was loosened. For a father, those shackles cut straight through the instinct to protect. He could hear a child crying in the dark. He could feel the woman beside him trembling. He could want to move just a little closer to comfort someone, but every small movement pulled pain through another body. People chained together had to learn how to breathe, sleep, fear, and suffer in the same rhythm. Because on that ship, even pain was forced to be shared through metal. The artifacts that remain today make this history harder to hide. In museums like the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, shackles, chains, and metal restraints connected to slavery are not just old objects. They are what remains of a world that placed control directly onto the human body. The case of the São José Paquete de Africa, a slave ship that sank off the coast of Cape Town in 1794, also reminds us why evidence from slave ships carries so much weight. When history is told with clean words like transportation or trade, those pieces of iron stand as hard evidence of a system that crushed the bodies and spirits of Black people. Even when cold iron closed around their wrists and ankles, enslaved people still found ways to hold on to their humanity. A whispered prayer, a mother using her voice to calm her child when her hands were not free to hold them. A father fighting to survive one more day because somewhere inside him, family and home were still alive. Shackles were made to keep the body still, but they could not lock away memory, love, or the will of Black people to survive. Number 4. Hanging torture. On a ship, rope was supposed to pull sails, hold masts, and fight against the sea wind. But on a slave ship, those same ropes could be used to lift a person off the deck, leave them hanging in pain, and turn their suffering into a warning for every other enslaved person on board. The cruelty of hanging torture lived in the moment a human being was pushed to the edge between life and death, while being forced to wait in fear. A rope around the neck made every breath shorter, unsteady, dependent on the hands of the men standing above deck. Someone who had already been weakened by days in darkness, hunger, thirst, sleeplessness, and panic could suddenly be pulled up in front of everyone. Their feet searched desperately for something to stand on. Their throat tightened with every broken breath. Below them, the other captives could only stand still and watch, because one cry, one look of resistance could bring the same punishment down on them next. Thomas Clarkson and other abolitionists gathered objects, testimonies, and images to drag this truth before the public. The slave trade was not simply carrying people across the ocean. It was controlling their bodies from the moment they were forced onto the ship. In that world, a rope could stop being a sailor's tool and become the thing that placed a person's breath in the hands of whoever gave the order. Later, many history books folded scenes like this into neat words like shipboard discipline punishment, or control of rebellion. Those words sound more like management than human suffering. They do not show a body pulled up and hanged over the ocean, and they do not show the eyes below, watching in silence because they feared they could be next. When violence is written in language that is clean, the first thing that disappears is often the face of the person who endured it. If a society could call that ship transportation, how many times did it soften the truth of people being hanged so the entire hold would learn fear? Number 5. Forced feeding. On slave ships, some captured Africans resisted in the only way they still could. They closed their mouths and refused to eat. During the Middle Passage, where nearly 1.8 million people never survived to the other shore, that refusal frightened slave traders. Not because they cared about human life, but because every death before arrival meant profit slipping away. Forced feeding became a way to break the last act of resistance still left inside the captive body. The writings of Alexander Falconbridge, who once served on slave ships before becoming a witness for the abolitionist movement, show that captives who refused food could be forced to open their mouths and made to swallow. On those ships, their lives were not protected as human lives. They were kept alive as the remaining value of cargo. Later, Thomas Clarkson and other British abolitionists gathered evidence from the slave trade and brought it before the public. Among the objects often mentioned was the speculum aureus, a metal instrument used to pry open the mouths of captives when they pressed their lips shut and refused to eat. Forced feeding was cruel because it took away the captives' final right to refuse. They had already lost their homeland, their families, their freedom, and they were locked below deck, being carried toward a land they never chose. Food, something meant to be tied to care and life, was turned into a tool for dragging an exhausted human being back into the business, waiting on the other side of the ocean. And yet, that refusal still left something powerful in Black history. They resisted even when almost every door had been shut against them. They held on to dignity through the smallest things they had left. A breath, a look, a mouth that would not open. Forced feeding was created to break that resistance. But the fact that it existed tells us something else too. Their will to be free was so strong that an entire ship had to find a way to suppress it. Number 6. Sealed hatches. What happens when dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people are trapped below deck, and the only opening that lets outside air in is sealed shut? On slave ships, the hatch above the hold was the only source of light and air for the people chained below. Once that hatch was closed, the whole space could turn suffocating fast. Heat rose. Air stopped moving. Panic began to spread through the darkness. The people trapped underneath could not open it from the inside. Their next breath depended completely on the men standing above deck. Sealing the hatch was sometimes recorded as a way to keep order on the ship. The crew feared rebellion. The weather had turned rough, or they wanted to keep the captives hidden below. On paper, it sounds like a shipboard decision. But under those planks, every time the hatch came down, the hold sank deeper into heat, body odor, darkness, and fear rising little by little. Later, many history books would fold scenes like this into neat phrases like "kept below deck" or "poor ventilation." But those words feel far too light for what it meant to lie inside a packed hold, not knowing when the hatch would open again, breathing air thick with body odor, waste, damp wood, sickness, and fear with nowhere to escape. That was the cruelty of it. The hatch did not touch the skin like a whip or a chain, but it could choke an entire group of enslaved people with darkness, heat, and the terror of being forgotten beneath the floorboards of the ship. Number 7. Forced dancing. Historical records of the transatlantic slave trade show that many captains forced captured Africans onto the deck to walk, dance, or move in rhythm. In The Slave Ship, A Human History, historian Marcus Rediker explains that captives were often forced to dance to keep their muscles working and reduce death rates, because every person who survived the voyage meant profit once the ship reached shore. In some cases, sailors used instruments or hand clapping to keep people moving, whether they wanted to or not. They were made to stand when their limbs were still numb, forced to step stomp, or dance on command, even when their bodies were worn down by hunger, thirst, sickness, and fear. Those too weak to move could be yelled at, dragged up, or whipped. Alexander Falconbridge, a British naval surgeon who worked on slave ships in the 18th century, recorded that captives were sometimes forced to exercise on deck and could be beaten if they refused or were too weak to do it. And still, inside every forced step, there was a memory the ship could never fully control. Black people carried rhythm, songs, body language, and traditions from communities that had lived free before they were kidnapped and pushed toward the sea. Slave traders could force them to move to protect their investment, but they could not turn all of that culture into property. Those memories and traditions would later help shape Afro-Atlantic cultures across the Americas, standing as proof that even in the cruelest conditions, people still found ways to hold on to who they were. Number 8. Sexual exploitation. Who could a woman cry out to when all around her there was only the ocean, the darkness, and the men holding the keys? On slave ships, sexual exploitation began with that absolute isolation. A black girl or a black mother could be separated from the group, called up to the deck, kept in a hidden corner, or placed under the eyes of men who saw her body as part of the cargo waiting to be sold. In the middle of the ocean, she had no home to run back to, no family free enough to protect her, and no law willing to step down into the hold just to hear her say she was afraid. Even the sound of footsteps stopping too long above the wooden planks could make a mother pull her daughter closer to her chest. A young girl called away from the crowd could understand that silence might be the only way to keep more harm from falling on the people lying beside her. The ship's records still counted bodies, prices, ports, and losses. But the nights, women stayed awake trying to protect their bodies, and what little dignity they had left were abandoned in the coldest silence of history. Number 9. Thrown overboard. In 1781, aboard the slave ship Zong, more than 130 Africans were thrown into the Atlantic Ocean. When a captured African was seen as too weak, too sick, or no longer valuable enough to sell, their life could be pushed off the ship like damaged cargo. During the Atlantic crossing, where sharks often followed slave ships because of the smell of death and waste, enslaved people who were considered to have lost value could be thrown into the sea and left as prey for the sharks. But what makes the Zong case so chilling is what happened after the ship reached land. The story was not treated as the killing of human beings. It entered the legal record as an insurance dispute. The people thrown into the ocean were not asked for their names. They were not remembered as mothers, fathers, children, siblings, or human beings who once had a home. They were pulled into the language of compensation, as if the most important question was not who had died, but who was responsible for the financial loss. The ocean swallowed their bodies, but the system on land tried to swallow their dignity too. And if history only remembers the Zong as a maritime incident, how many cries across the Atlantic were silenced beneath words that sounded more legal than human? Number 10. Thumbscrew torture. Before they were dragged down into the hold, the hands of African people belonged to their own lives. Those were the hands that held children, started fires, planted seeds, and carried the last memories of home. But on slave ships, those same hands were chained, controlled, and in some of the cruelest punishments, forced into devices like the thumbscrew, a metal tool made to tighten around the fingers. The cruelty of this punishment was in the way it took one small part of the body and made the whole person bend under pain. Fingers are not usually the first thing people think about when they hear the word torture, but once they were squeezed, even the smallest movement could become unbearable. A captive did not have to be beaten in the middle of the deck to understand where power lived. Sometimes, power was right there in the hand of the man turning a metal screw. Abolitionists like Thomas Clarkson collected objects from the slave trade and brought them before the British public. Those pieces of metal made it harder for people to keep hiding behind clean words like trade or transportation. Behind them were hands that once wanted to hold on to life, but were forced to suffer so they could be taught silence. And even when metal tightened around their fingers, It could never take everything black hands carried: memory, love, prayer, and the will to survive one more day. These stories show that the horror of slavery did not begin on the plantation. It began in the dark below deck, where human beings were treated as cargo but still carried memory, love, and dignity. If these voices deserve to be remembered, share this story, leave the word "remember," and subscribe to Hidden Black Chronicles as we keep bringing buried stories back into the light.